Well, the richest way of understanding classical Christian education is to, I think, understand it against the backdrop of the educational project of the Greco-Roman world. If you take your K to 12 education, all the subjects there, history, art, literature, music, science, math, so on, and you were to boil it down to two subjects, basically be word and number, language and order. And the reason for that is in the Greco-Roman world, the creation myths that they had, they all described the gods ordering and arranging the world in accordance with their words. So words order the world. And this linguistic order was captured in a single concept known as the logos for the Greeks. The Romans would call it the quintessence. There are four elements in this classical cosmology: earth, air, fire, and water. And the question is, what's the fifth element? What is the quintessence? What holds it all together and gives it this proportionality and this symmetry? And the answer the Greeks gave was the logos. It was this linguistic order, this divine principle of coherence. And so a true education was understanding the totality of life in relation to the logos, in relation to this linguistic order. So word and number, trivium and quadrivium. So the trivium taught students word, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And the quadrivium taught students number, so math, geometry, music, cosmology. And these are the basic frames of reference for the emergence of a distinctly Christian education, where the logos is recalibrated now around Christ in accordance with John's prologue. In the beginning was the logos was with God, the logos was God. And the trivium and the quadrivium, they transform into lenses that teach the student to see Christ in every area of life, as the totality of the cosmos is calibrated around him, who is the one in whom all things cohere. So the formation of a Christocentric soul is the goal of classical Christian education. In the classical world, the human person was seen as a microcosm of the larger macrocosmic world. The human is literally a mikros cosmos, a little cosmos. And the Greeks saw the human person as having at least three qualities, what they called a logos, an ethos, and a pathos. Logos are our intellectual, rational capacities. Ethos are our moral capacities. And pathos are our emotional, our aesthetic qualities. Well, because we're little microcosms, that means the world in which we live, this cosmos in which we live, also has three qualities to it as well, what we call three cosmic values: the true, the good, and the beautiful. The true corresponds to our intellectual capacities. The good corresponds to our ethical capacities, and the beautiful corresponds to our aesthetic capacities. And this is how we know the logos, as we talked about in another session. The logos, that which holds the world together, is revealed through these three cosmic values: the true, the good, and the beautiful. And the idea, the whole project of classical education was to produce a balance in the soul between the rational, ethical, and aesthetic capacities of the human person. So we all know people who are all reason, but they have no sense of the lovely or the beautiful and so forth. We know people who are all, for sensuality and so forth, but have no rational capacities. And so what the Greeks were interested in doing was tapping into the true, the good, and the beautiful in the cosmic realm in order to bring about a similar balance of logos, ethos, pathos in the human person. Yeah, beauty in the eyes of the beholder, that's a very modern thing. That comes in the rise of the modern age and the rejection of this whole classical cosmology that truth, goodness, and beauty are embedded in. We have to understand that for the classical mind, beauty wasn't a personal, private opinion. Beauty was actually a physics. It was a physics principle of attraction. Beauty drew us somewhere. And so when we find something beautiful, when we find something attractive, the question that classical education asks is, to what are you being drawn? Are you being drawn to something that is true and good? Or are you being drawn to something that's not, something that's a lie, something that's evil? The key is what's being evoked within us. The Greeks understood we were not attracted only to the beautiful. We were attracted to things that were not very good for us, the ugly, the pornographic. This is embodied in the mythologies of the Muses and the Sirens. The Muses are the daughters of Zeus that would inspire truth, goodness, and beauty. The Sirens were these sea nymphs that would use a fake beauty to lure sailors to their death through bewitching songs. So the question is, what are you attracted to? And they would contemplate, what is being evoked. Beauty always evokes love, whereas something that is false evokes lust, what they called epithumia in the Greek. Truth always attracts. Lies always seduce. And that's the key difference. And so when beauty exists external to me, when beauty actually exists out there, now I have something to conform my soul to be drawn up out of myself so that my soul can blossom and my humanity can flourish. Yeah, the way we look at education today, actually, historically speaking, is very, very radical. The reason why we tend to think of education as so focused toward SATs and college and good job and 5-car garages and so forth is because we've lost something in the modern age. Because the modern age really knows, it defines knowledge solely through science. It's lost the enchanted nature of the cosmos. It's lost the meaning, the truth, the goodness, the beauty, the logos. It's embodied in the cosmos. So for a pre-modern mind, the classical mind, education wasn't truly education unless the student learned what was the true, the good, and the beautiful. What was meaning? What was purpose? Why am I here? These are the things that allowed the soul to flourish. These are the things that allowed my humanity to blossom. Instead, today, we think in terms of vocation, not so much education. Vocation, as C.S. Lewis had pointed out, is something in the Greco-Roman world that slaves learned. They learned a trade. But free men, the aristocracy, the literate class, they learned education. They learned the logos, the true, the good, and the beautiful, the meaning and the purpose inherent in this world. And it's only when we presume that the world is filled with meaning and purpose that all of a sudden all the beautiful history and art and literature and music and science and mathematics, those begin to blossom as lenses through which we can see divine meaning and purpose in every single subject. That's what education ultimately is. It enables us to be human. In classical education, the development of the moral character of the student is central. As a matter of fact, the moral character demonstrates whether that, like we talked about earlier, the logos is balanced with the pathos, the rational side of the person's balance with the emotional or aesthetic side. How do you know? Well, by their fruits you will know them. How they're acting ethically. C.S. Lewis liked to call it, we develop men with chests, the virtuous men. And so serving our fellow man is an intrinsic component to developing this ethical side of the human person. We have to understand, particularly in our Christian culture, this 1,500 years of Christian civilization, we lived in an economy of grace. And in an economy of grace, the people with much are called to give what they have to the people who do not have much. And the people who don't have much receive those gifts as gifts. It's grace. They receive it in gratitude and in love and endearment. And by giving these gifts, if I have much, I cultivate a sense of considering the needs of others as more important than my own. I cultivate a sense of virtue. So you have gratitude and virtue coming together in the communion of an economy of grace. This is what we're trying to teach our students in a day of service. It is in stark contrast to our modern age today, where we've replaced an economy of grace with an economy of entitlement and taxation. What we've done is we've, in effect, said now people are entitled to other people's stuff. And then we take other people's stuff irrespective of whether they want to voluntarily give it or not. And this creates a completely different kind of society. A society of entitlement and taxation is fundamentally different than a society of an economy of grace. We're trying to foster a new generation of people that are going to live out a citizenship that embodies that kind of economy of grace. Yeah, when we're talking about a liberal education, we're not talking about a particularly political education. The term liberal has been used that way over the last couple hundred years. What we mean by the liberal arts, actually, is the education of the free man, as the Greco-Roman world would understand it. The aristocracy, the free person, would learn a certain education that was concomitant with his freedom. In the Christian tradition, obviously liberty is a key Christian value in the book of Galatians. It's through word and sacrament, through the gift of Christ, that we are made free. And this freedom spills out into the way we see the totality of life. Prior to the coming of Christ, our understanding of the world was frustrated by sin, death, and the devil. Christ blows that tripartite prison apart. And he frees us now to see the totality of all the particularities, all the diversities of life into a single coherent person, namely Christ himself, the Logos, as we've spoken about. And so the 7 liberal arts and the trivium and the quadrivium, the 3 in the trivium, 4 in the quadrivium, these liberal arts become these lenses, these means by which we're able to see Christ in every area of life, in history and art and literature and music, using grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, and math and music and geometry and cosmology. All these things end up cohering in Christ, who is the source of our freedom. This is what we mean by liberal arts. Liberal arts are the means by which the sinful soul that's been redeemed in Christ, redeemed in word and sacrament, can now spill out into an educational project by which I can see all things made new. Well, the classical Christian tradition is very much caught up with this thing called culture, because it's very much caught up with this thing called paideia. Paideia is a Greek term that had a twofold meaning in the Greco-Roman world. At first, it meant an educational project that sought to initiate a student into a culture, into a particular way of being human. But it eventually took on the meaning of the content of that culture. So it was basically the Greek counterpart to the Latin cultura. So paideia had this twofold meaning. It was both the content of culture and the initiation process by which a student was educated into that culture. The key text for a classical Christian culture is Ephesians 6:4, where Paul exhorts fathers to raise their children in the paideia to Kyriou, in the paideia of the Lord. And the interesting thing about this passage is Paul's not talking about a paideia of the Greeks or a paideia of the Romans. He talks about a paideia of the Lord. This is a paideia that is not found in this world. It's a paideia that's literally breaking in another world. And so here we have this whole new conception of the true, the good, and the beautiful revealed through the Trinity and the Incarnation that becomes the basis for distinctly Christian culture. and therefore a basis for an educational project to initiate students into that culture. And so classical Christian education, it emphasizes the formation of a sacred space through which students are initiated into a distinctly Christian culture. So we tend to emphasize that special places require special rules, just like the way you decorate the home during Christmas. And yet these rules don't stifle freedom. This is a liberal education. This is all about liberating the students so that their humanity can flourish. I like the way G.K. Chesterton put it. The whole purpose of rules and orders in Christianity is to allow good things to run wild. So we emphasize things like school uniforms, which demonstrate a common purpose that we all share. We practice a godly etiquette where the students learn to honor their elders. The young men will hold the doors for the ladies. They learn to sing the music of the spheres. They learn about an art that redeems the senses and prepares their bodies for the resurrection, all this beautiful stuff. So classical education seeks to foster a sacred space for the contemplation of the true, the good, and the beautiful, so as to allow these students' faith to flourish. Yeah, it's important, I think at least, never to think of what we're doing in terms of fostering Christian culture as some kind of retreat, as creating some kind of commune separated from the world. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Christianity has always had a very distinctly public witness. The church from day one, as we see particularly in the letters of Paul, understood itself as proclaiming a gospel that caught up the entire cosmos into the transformative life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So we're not trying to teach kids here to be sheltered from the world, to circle the wagons, to retreat from the world. It's the exact opposite. By creating a Christian culture, not only are students embodying truth, living out the truth, but a distinctly Christian culture always exposes the larger, dominant, non-Christian institutions to be what they are. They're lies. They're not true. Any place where Christ is not acknowledged as Lord is a lie. And so what we're doing with our students is we're teaching them a real robust public faith. A faith that has distinctly demographic, economic, political, sociological frames of reference that they can take with them and bring anywhere they're planted in the wider world. There is no way of exposing the dominant institutions to be the lie that they are by simply supporting them and participating in them. You have to have a culture that comes in and that demonstrates and embodies a world not of this one, literally a world where, behold, all things are made new. Yeah, the incarnation draws everything into itself. Christ and his salvation draws the whole world up into himself. And so we're not worried about pagan literature. We read Homer and Hesiod and Plato and Aristotle and Caesar and Tacitus. We'll read and we'll invite speakers who don't share our Christian worldview. Students can engage any speaker in any book from a moral imagination that's just been filled with scripture and Christian culture. They're able to see truth, goodness, and beauty in all things, and they're also able to discern where they fall short, where they fall apart. So from very early on in the church, I would argue from Paul, but certainly explicitly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries in places like Alexandria and Antioch, the educational system that the church came up with was a distinctly classical education. They didn't reject Homer and Hesiod. They relativized Homer and Hesiod to Moses and Paul, the Gospels. Now the Scriptures were the foundational text by which we understand the totality of life, but that means understanding the totality of life. So it's bringing in Homer, it's bringing in Hesiod, it's bringing in the pagans, it's bringing in alternative views and training critical thinking in relationship to Christ, who is the logos, the ratio, the rational principle of the world, so that we're able to understand the totality of life in relation to him. It's particularly the Reformed tradition that puts emphasis on what's called the noetic effects of sin. The noetic effects of sin means that the mind itself has fallen along with the soul and along with the body and the senses as well. And so the totality of the human person needs to be redeemed. The totality of the human person needs a means by which that which was once large, that has since shriveled because of sin, can now become large again. And so we put a tremendous emphasis on the teaching of logic and reason and critical thinking, so as to bring about a blossoming of the entire person, particularly what we would call the logos side of the human person, the rational or logical side of the person. And so we focus a lot on critical thinking skills. We focus an entire year on logic proper. And then we're constantly engaging the students to think through whatever any person is putting forward, both in relationship to what the person is saying and in relationship to the Scriptures. Yeah, classical education does often get this prejudice that we're focusing solely on Homer, Hesiod, all the liberal arts kind of thing, and that the math and the sciences, we don't really need that. It's been pointed out that 4 out of the 7 liberal arts are mathematics and science. The whole quadrivium is about studying the order, the symmetry, the proportionality of the world in which we live. That's part of the logos. Christians look at science, however, very differently. We see science as the study of God's magic, as it were. It's the study of God's wonder and awe embedded in the cosmos. We see mathematics quite differently as well. We don't see math as something you have to learn so that you know how to count change when you get a job. Math is encountering a world that's really not of this one. We've never bumped into a number. We've never seen an actual circle. These are mystical things. Where does the number 1 live? Is it in the North Pole? Where is it? And yet, if numbers didn't actually exist, if shapes didn't actually exist, then bridges would collapse. And so what the Greeks would say is, well, no, there really are numbers, there really are shapes, but they exist in a different world, you see. And it's not just another world, it's a perfect world. 1 + 1 always equals 2. And 1 never had a beginning, and 1 never seems to have an end. It's an eternal world. So when we did mathematics, we were in divine communion. We're communing with another world, a perfect divine world. Christians picked up on this, particularly Augustine. So whenever we're doing math, we're communing with the mind of God. So classical schools put tremendous emphasis on math and science, but we do it in such a way that really awakens the imaginations of the students, so that through math, through science, they were able to see the glory of God. Well, the Amoral Imagination is a term coined by the 18th century British statesman Edmund Burke to denote specifically the integrative role, literally the integrity of the imagination. The imagination's been gifted to humans by God to perceive the divinely infused meaning and purpose embedded into the cosmos, and then provide that point of integration where our logical, our ethical, and our aesthetic experiences can be integrated into a harmonious whole. The tradition that Burke is getting at goes all the way back to the Greeks, where they made a distinction when it came to knowledge between scienta and theoria. Scienta involved problem solving, like modern day science, but theoria took knowledge deeper. Theoria took the sum total of all the different diversities that scienta would examine and saw them all in relation to this harmonious whole, particularly in the Christian tradition, as a vision of Christ in whom all things are made new. And so the Christian tradition puts a tremendous amount of emphasis on the imagination, particularly in study, the spiritual discipline of study. I think it was the Catholic theologian Sirens who called study a prayer to the truth. What we have to remember is that in the modern age, knowledge is rooted in doubt. You have to prove to me something that it's worth my time before I'm going to give it the time of day. Otherwise, just simply don't bother me. Classical Christian knowledge is very different. Classical Christian knowledge is rooted in awe and wonder, not doubt. G.K. Chesterton picked this up perfectly in his Ethics of Elfland, a text our students read. He noted that a Christian conception of knowledge is one that is rooted in the fact that we were created to be astounded and astonished. This creates a fundamentally different orientation to the world. When the teacher puts forward to the student a book or a piece of music or a subject, in the modern age, the teacher feels that he or she is under the obligation to try to sell the student on this subject or on this book or on this piece of music. The teacher has to show the student it's worth their time because they're rooted in doubt. And we don't have knowledge until you've dispelled that doubt. But in the classical Christian knowledge, the orientation of the world is very different. The teacher is able to produce or present to the student a subject, a piece of music, or a book, not as something that is worth their time, but as something of which we're not worthy. That's a fundamentally different orientation that awakens awe and wonder. This is the moral imagination. We need to constantly exhort our students, expect to be awed, expect to be astonished by what you encounter in this class. Yes, it's often hard and tedious work, but treasure hunting always is. You were created to be astonished. Well, I certainly appreciate the sentiment behind the whole salt and light argument. But I don't think it takes into consideration the fact that biblical salt and light is distinctly public salt and light. Salt and light deals with the public realm, public life. Christianity and the gospel is not contained solely in the private world, in terms of private introspection and so forth. It is a radically public faith. It incorporates the totality of demographic, economic, political, sociological life into itself. To be salt and light is literally to declare, behold, all things are made new. The problem is when you step into a public school situation, as they're called, and I even have a problem with that term. I think all education is public. All education forms a particular kind of social order. But nevertheless, we walk into a public school. What you have is you have this massive wall that separates one's private life from one's public life. Religion belongs in one's private life, whereas all the demographic, economic, political, sociological fields, that belongs in the public life. And so what you end up seeing in the public schools is the frustration of the gospel. The gospel's not allowed to bear its public witness in this secularized space. The whole point of secularization is to erect this iron curtain between one's private life and religious sensibilities and public life and neutral space. And so inevitably what happens is the gospel gets watered down. The gospel gets emptied of its truth which is always public. Truth, again, is not private persuasion. Truth is that which is absolute and unquestionable at a social level as it reflects reality. And so as you empty the gospel of its truth, it collapses into mere private and personal persuasion. And that's what salt and light becomes. It becomes the sharing of a personal, private, testimonial Christianity. And inevitably, the gospel is compromised. We have to understand what modern public space is today. Modern public space is secularized space. And what secularism is, it's a nexus of social strategies that seeks to marginalize any alternative vision of the public into private sphere, cutting it off from the public realm and in effect diffusing it of its truth, of its objective reality. So what we have to understand is that with the way the modern age has set things up, religion by its nature belongs in private life. It is not allowed to flourish in public discourse. And so not even teachers who are Christian in a public school environment are able to express that Christianity in any public way. It can be private. It could be, on the down low, one-on-one with the student kind of thing. But again, that's personal. That's private. That's not truth. You see, that has no more truth than yoga class, you see. Truth is something that is objective. It's public. It's verifiable, as it were. Not personal, private persuasion. You're having a hard time. Well, if you have Jesus in your life, you won't have such a hard time. Well, you could do that with anything. You can do that with a Pizza Hut. Take them out to pizza. They'll feel better. So this is the problem. We've bought into this conditioning that's been going on for a good couple of 100 years, subtle at first, getting quite explicit today, where it is natural and normal to have a dichotomy, a Berlin Wall that exists between public and private, between government and church, between fact and faith, between science and knowledge, between truth and belief. We've been pushed out of this public realm, and we simply don't have the discourse to be able to address it, not in the way the church has been conducting itself over the last several decades. This is why classical Christian education is so exciting for me, because I think what it is doing is it is embodying a parallel public. It's embodying a different way of doing public life so as to live out the truth. If the secular world is one that says, look, the public square is, as it's been called, naked. There's not going to be any, quote, religion in this world. So we're going to redefine religion in such a way that excludes the state and science and technology, that kind of thing. If that's one public there, what classical education is doing is it's building an alternative public. It's building alternative space parallel to the public spaces, the secular public spaces, that enables students to embody and live out the truth. And this, therefore, opens up the fact that any kind of public space that denies truth, that denies goodness, that denies beauty like the secular space does, it opens it up for what it is. It reveals it for what it is. It's a lie. By living out the truth, these larger dominant institutions that are secular are exposed for what they are. They're lies. So what classical Christian education is doing is it's as an extension of church and family, it's reawakening the center of classical Christian society. The center of classical Christian society, where all of politics and economics and sociology revolved, was the church, the family, and the community. Over here in the secular world, all of politics, economics, and sociology is revolving around the state, science, and technology. You can even see that in the urban planning. In the medieval period, for example, a town, a city, village began with the church, began with the cathedral, and the town calibrated around that. Today, it begins with municipal buildings. Okay, it begins with the banks, the town halls, whatever it is, and then if there is a church there, it's right next to Pizza Hut. You know? So what we have in classical education is this wonderful opportunity to begin the process of recalibrating the totality of economic, political, sociological life back around church, family, and Christian community as it's embodied in a classical Christian school. Classical Christian education assumes a particular kind of cosmology. It assumes a cosmos that's filled with meaning, filled with purpose, and that's held together coherently through Christ. Christ is the Logos, according to the John prologue. In the beginning was the Logos was with God, the Logos was God. And this whole Logos principle, as we've talked about before, is this divine linguistic order that holds the world together. Christians understand this Logos to be Christ. He is the one in whom all things cohere. And so when you're doing education, your education is a true education only to the extent that it is able to take the diversity of all the subjects that it learns and is able to see this coherence in them, this beautiful logocentric vision of Christ. This would be the discipline of theoria in the classical scheme of knowledge. What's going on today is we no longer believe that the world is filled with meaning and purpose anymore. It's largely because we don't think through theoria, we think through science. And you can't put meaning in a test tube, you see. Meaning is impervious to the scientific method. And if it can't be scientifically proven, then it cannot be known, as it were. And so now the world is just there. It's there to be studied. And then we have all these subjects that we've inherited from the liberal arts tradition: history, art, literature, music, science, mathematics. So what do we do with them? Well, we study them and we create specialties out of them. So we'll create mathematicians out of them, and scientists, and liberal arts people, and business people, and on and on. And so what you end up having, particularly in the universities today, is you have the creation of a multiversity. All the subjects begin to be fragmented. They move away from each other. They don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. So if you go into the science department of a university, you're going to be told one thing, and then you go off to the liberal arts department, you're going to be told a completely different other thing about the nature of reality and so forth. It is only by seeing the world as having an inherent integrity, it has an inherent divinely infused meaning, purpose that's discernible by the rational mind, that's revealed to us in Christ through word and sacrament, and that's celebrated in worship, where both creation and cathedral praise God together. It's only then that you have a true education that takes the totality, the diversity of things, and puts them into a coherent whole. Once you have this fullness of education, as it were, what does it do? It does what the Greeks were always trying to do, but were frustrated in doing it because of the whole problem of sin, death, and the devil that Christianity is able to resolve. It puts us in a harmonious relationship into the cosmos. Now we know what our place is in this cosmos. There's incredible humble feeling, a humble orientation towards our God. True education should always put us on our knees. True education should always evoke a sense of praise and awe and wonder. Jonathan Edwards, in his work, The End for Which God Created the World, pointed out that heaven is not static. It's not like we just go off and hang out on a cloud for a while. He draws from Gregory of Nyssa's epectasis, this idea that heaven is this journey, this eternal journey, where we eternally traverse the infinite majesty of God's glory. God is so glorious that it would literally take an eternity to exhaust that glory. So there's never a time where there's no more glory to discover and to enjoy. We're always learning more and more and more about God, which is awakening more and more awe and wonder. And I like to think that classical Christian education is beginning that journey. It's beginning that infinite, eternal journey of traversing God's beauty and majesty, where we begin to discover his glory now, but this is nothing. As Lewis would say at the last book of the Narnia series, this is but the title page of the grand story to come. Jonathan Edwards once described the fall in a very, very profound way. He said that when Adam and Eve were created, they were created with souls that were large and that were beautiful, radiant. And they were able to embrace each other. They were able to embrace the whole world. They were even able to embrace God. But when they sinned, something happened. Those large, beautiful souls, they shrank. They shriveled up. And like some great astringent, they contracted and fell in love with the self. And now everything in life is understood in relation to the self. And so what's redemption? Redemption is through the word and the sacraments. The soul begins to become large again. It begins to awaken. It begins to blossom. And what classical Christian education seeks to do is to come alongside the word and sacraments and to draw out that soul, enable it to be human again. And so the noetic effects of sin, where the way we think has fallen, now through the training of logic and through critical thinking and argumentation, debate, now our thinking can start to come back again. Our ethical fall begins to get plugged into days of service, considering the needs of others as more important than our own. And our aesthetic lives. There's this beautiful tradition in classical Christian theology of the redemption of the senses, where the senses have fallen right along with the soul. Adam and Eve were in the garden, this beautiful, lush place. They're kicked out into the desert, and so now their tastes become deadened, their smell is deadened, their hearing is deadened. And through word and sacrament, through sacred space, through sacred music, through sacred visual art, the body's senses begin to be restored. Now we can taste again. We can taste garden taste. We can smell again. We can hear again. The whole body begins to awaken. And this is the goal of classical Christian education. Classical Christian education seeks to work alongside the words and sacraments so as to allow the whole human person, the intellectual, moral, and aesthetic dimensions of the human person blossom so that we can become human again. And as Christianity loves to emphasize, this blossoming, this humanity is preparing our whole being for our future resurrection.